folks, everybody sing. Now when the saints go marching in, there is a house in New Orleans. Pumped a lot of pain down in New Orleans.
We took a little bacon and we took a little beans and we caught the bloody British in a town in New Orleans.
Yes, I want to be in that number. When the saints go marching in.
Welcome back to the History of New Orleans. Last time, we went over some of the changes New Orleans went through during the last 2 decades of the 18th century. We made special note of the Great Fire of 1788 that destroyed 2/3 of the city, leaving many residents homeless and wrecking the economy. The city was able to gradually recover from the fire due to the quick action of Governor Miro and help from neighboring countries, including the newly formed United States. A year after a great fire swept over New Orleans, the Great Conflagration of the French Revolution began. It would eventually spread across the Atlantic Ocean to the New World and affect everyone in some way. For some people, like the people of Haiti, the revolution brought, revolutionary changes, but for others, like the people of New Orleans, the revolution was observed as more of a quaint curiosity, while life went along the same path as before. Francisco Carondelet was governor of Louisiana during most of the French Revolution, including the small portion where Spain was at war with France, but he didn't have to deal with large-scale violence in the form of military campaigns or popular revolts. He did have to oversee New Orleans during the turbulent years of the early Haitian Revolution, where he was forced to turn back many refugees due to Spain's laws against the import of foreign slaves to their colonies. In the case of foreign powers, Carondelet was mostly worried about continuing American expansion, as the US and Spain had left the American Revolutionary War on not the best of terms, particularly due to the fact that they had competing claims in Florida and west of the Appalachian Mountains. New Orleans was also the gateway between the Mississippi River watershed and the Gulf of Mexico, and so Carondelet had to contend with American desires to have access to the river and Gulf, while ostensibly they were both owned by Spain. All of these issues were hammered out eventually in 1795 with Pinckney's Treaty. Louisiana and America would settle into an uneasy partnership for the rest of Carondelet's term. Considering the turbulent events occurring across the globe in the late 1790s, Carondelet had a relatively uneventful tenure as governor. In 1797, Carondelet departed from New Orleans to take up residence in South America as the new president of the Real Audiencia de Quito, a Spanish administrative district in the north of the continent. He was replaced in Louisiana by Manuel Gayoso de Lemos. He was yet another governor who had ties to Alejandro O'Reilly, as he had been a part of the company that had put down the Creole Revolt in 1769. Before he became governor of the territory, Gayoso de Lemos was able to gain extensive experience of the region as the commander of the border region of Louisiana called Natchez District. Here he served under Miro and then Carondelet, ensuring the frontier was guarded against possible American encroachments, while also encouraging select groups of Americans to settle in Louisiana. Of these groups, he was mostly interested in Catholics, who felt left out in Protestant-dominated America, but who were a good fit for the heavily Catholic Spanish territory, and rich land speculators who were willing to buy large plots in the wilderness of Louisiana. Due to Gayoso de Lemos' extensive contact with these disgruntled groups in America, he was able to successfully thwart many attempts by the new country to move into Louisiana. He even managed to hear word of a planned U.S. invasion of New Orleans, which was then prevented. This extensive experience and relationship building meant that Gayoso de Lemos was the natural pick to succeed Carondelet in 1797. There isn't much to say about his term in office in New Orleans, as unlike Miro or Carondelet, who each served for 6 years, Gayoso de Lemos only served for 2. During his 2 years, he focused on building up fortifications and training men for combat in order to better prepare Louisiana to act as a protective wall for Spanish Texas and Spanish interests in the Gulf. Remember, at this time, the French Revolutionary Wars were still raging in Europe, and stories of the bloodshed in Haiti were spreading throughout the New World. It was not out of the question that Louisiana would need to be prepared to enter into a continent-wide or even global conflict. On the civil side of things, Gayoso de Lemos instituted a novel trash collection service in New Orleans in hopes of decreasing the spread of disease throughout the city. It is ironic, then, that he was the only Spanish governor to die in office when he succumbed to yellow fever in 1799. His successor was appointed at the time of his death, but due to health complications he was unable to assume his duties as governor for a while. So there was an interregnum period of 2 years where Louisiana was governed by 3 governors, who mostly just held space until Juan Manuel de Salcedo arrived in 1801. He would be the last Spanish governor of Louisiana, and let's just say that he left the citizens of New Orleans with a bad taste in their mouths in terms of Spanish government. Salcedo was constantly butting heads with the local leadership, and was much more confrontational with the Americans than any of his predecessors. Suffice it to say, the people of New Orleans were happy to see him go when France regained the territory in 1803. The process of Louisiana being returned to the French was slow. It started in 1800 when Spain and the French Republic, now under the control of First Consul Napoleon Bonaparte, signed a secret treaty called the Third Treaty of San Ildefonso. This treaty was the first mention of the idea of exchanging Louisiana for newly acquired territory in Tuscany. It was a secret deal because the French were also negotiating treaties with America at this time, and France annexing such a large and disputed territory right in America's backyard was sure to cause commotion. The transfer was confirmed and made public a year later with the Treaty of Aranjuez in 1801. By this time, Juan Manuel de Salcedo had arrived in New Orleans, and his mandate was changed from running the colony to preparing it for the handoff to France. While Napoleon still had designs for Louisiana to be the basis for a glorious French empire in the Americas, he was not impatient in terms of completing the transfer. He still had to deal with the revolution in Haiti before any dream of French imperialism could be achieved. That is why it took him almost a year to appoint Pierre Clement Lessart to be the colonial prefect of Louisiana, so he could oversee the transfer and administer the colony until a permanent governor was appointed. Lessart was also in no rush to make his way to New Orleans. He was appointed in August of 1802, but did not depart until January of 1803, and arrived at the Louisiana capital in March of 1803. While he was putzing around, the situation in Haiti shifted dramatically. In October of 1802, 2 of the most accomplished Haitian generals who had previously defected to France switched sides again and brought renewed fervor to the rebels' cause. A month later, Leclerc, the commander-in-chief of the French forces in Haiti, died of yellow fever. Then the cherry on top came in May of 1803, when Britain went to war with Napoleonic France and effectively doomed the Haitian expedition. By the time Lessart finally set foot in New Orleans in March, the final nail was already hammered into the coffin built for Napoleon's American dream. But Lessart did not know this. He arrived full of energy and ambition, ready to remake Louisiana in the image of French republicanism that had swept across the nations of Europe, proving their antiquated ideas of governance inferior. Technically speaking, Lessart didn't have full authority in Louisiana until France sent troops to replace the Spanish garrisons that provided security for the colony. However, he was eager to implement his ideas, so he bypassed the provision in the treaty that told him to wait and seized full control of Louisiana immediately. He hoped that he could leverage popular support from the majority Creole population to legitimize his seizure of power, but the population of New Orleans had mixed feelings about returning to being a French possession. On one hand, they were still fiercely culturally French. Despite nearly 40 years of Spanish rule, they still spoke French and cherished the customs that their ancestors had brought from the homeland. On the other hand, the French Revolution had repudiated many of these customs, especially those pertaining to the Catholic Church and its traditional dominance over all parts of society. Additionally, the change in government meant a change in the rules pertaining to how the Creole elite were able to make their money. They had settled into a balance of power with the Spanish government over the last few decades that had benefited their material interests, and now that Lessart had come to shake things up, they were not sure if this would be an improvement or chaos. The enslaved population, if they had any strong opinion on the matter of who their oppressors were, must have surely preferred the Spanish, which had given them more rights and freedoms than the French Code Noir, and the same can be said for the free people of color living in New Orleans. So across Louisiana society, there was apprehension concerning the return to French control. On top of all this, there was an idea bouncing around that had been barely more than a whisper the last time Louisiana was in such a situation. In the 40 years since Spain took control of the colony and had to put down the Creole revolt, the idea of self-determination, of independence from European colonial rule, had grown and strengthened. First, it was proven possible by the American Revolution, in which a colonial people severed the umbilical cord that spanned the Atlantic Ocean and set themselves as masters of their own destinies. The Creoles of Louisiana had fought in this revolution so that the Americans could be independent. Why shouldn't they fight for their own freedom? Then the French revolutionaries promulgated the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, which fanned the flames of liberation across the world, especially in the American colonies. The Declaration meant different things for different groups. For the Creole elite, they saw how the bourgeoisie of France had thrown off the yoke of the Ancien regime and took control of the country, establishing their own government, the First French Republic. For the enslaved masses of Louisiana, the Declaration did not explicitly denounce slavery, but it was implied in its statement that men are born and remain free and equal in rights, that the situation of slavery was unnatural and should be abolished. Neither group would get the chance to seize the reins of their own destiny. Lauson had begun throwing his weight around as soon as he arrived in New Orleans, but he didn't have the muscle to back it up, so his attempts to wrest control of the colony from the Spanish officials were in vain. He patiently waited for the French troops to arrive. 1 month passed. Then another. Then another. In July, he heard rumors that Louisiana had been sold to the United States for $15 million, which amounted to less than 3 cents per acre. Students in America are often taught how incredibly cheap the Louisiana Purchase was and are astonished that France would give up so much territory for so little money. Well, they are no less astonished than Robert Livingston, the chief negotiator for the Americans. Livingston was only authorized to purchase New Orleans from the French, and their offer was going to be around $10 million just for the city. To get New Orleans and the rest of Louisiana for nearly the same price was mind-boggling. Lauson wasn't just astonished, he was in complete disbelief. He wrote to Napoleon Bonaparte at the end of July, asking him if this was really true. He received his reply in mid-August. The rumors were true. He was now tasked with overseeing the transfer of Louisiana from Spain to France, and then immediately from France to the U.S. On October 30th, 1803, he presided over the ceremony in New Orleans, which handed the land to the French Republic. In 3 weeks, he would have to hand it over to U.S. Representatives William Claiborne and James Wilkinson. Over these 3 weeks, however, Lauson made several dramatic changes. Firstly, he abolished the Cabildo, the local council that had ruled the territory from New Orleans during the Spanish period. He replaced it with a hand-picked council of 10 local Creole elites and 2 American representatives, totally cutting the Spanish out of the government. This council then enacted 2 sweeping reforms during their short, lame duck tenure. First, they published the Napoleonic Code, a set of laws that had been promulgated by Napoleon to be the basis of governing throughout the French Empire, within the colonial charter. Then they reinstated the Code Noir to strip the enslaved peoples of their few rights and privileges they had gained under Spanish rule. Their last act was to shut down the only theater in New Orleans under the excuse that it was a fire hazard. Then, on the 20th of December, the last territorial transfer of Louisiana was completed, and the colony officially became a part of the United States of America. If the transfer from Spain to France had been haphazard and lazy, taking 3 years from the initial conception in 1800, then the transfer from France to the U.S. was haphazard but frantic. The new American officials were already present in New Orleans when the transfer occurred. In fact, they had overseen it. General James Wilkinson was the new head of all military affairs in the territory, while William Charles Claiborne was appointed by President Thomas Jefferson to oversee all civil matters. Both men represented the wealthy aristocratic elites of the southern United States, and so when they arrived in New Orleans and saw not only a large population of free people of color, but also that a large portion of the local militia was made up of armed people of color, they were shocked. Surprise soon gave way to fear, as Wilkinson and Claiborne feared that they would be unable to institute American governance in a place that so clearly rejected the specific ideas America had on race. New Orleans certainly wasn't what we would call an equal society, free from prejudice and discrimination, but it did have a clearly different approach to race than the rest of the American territories, especially the southern states. In order to prevent what Wilkinson and Claiborne saw as an inevitable revolt of slaves and free people of color, they requested that the government send 5,000 troops to New Orleans to subdue the population. The federal government was already in a tizzy over Louisiana before this request came in. Congress and the Senate had not been a part of the negotiations to buy the territory. Jefferson had gone over their heads to unilaterally approve of the purchase. Now they had to deal with all the problems that came with practically doubling the size of the U.S. and incorporating a large number of people who were entirely foreign to the Anglo-Americans. Their first act was to split the territory in two. New Orleans, in what is now the state of Louisiana, would become the territory of Orleans. The rest of it, from what is now Arkansas up to what are now the southern parts of Alberta and Saskatchewan, was named the territory of Louisiana, whose capital was St. Louis. Now that the land was split into more manageable pieces, the work began on Americanizing the frontier. No more was the divide felt stronger between Louisianians and Americans than the issue of race. While there were clear distinctions in the opinion on the multitude of colors the human race came in between the southern and northern states, there was not yet a strong and widespread abolitionist movement, and racism was baked into the American psyche as much as their peculiar version of liberty. In Louisiana, particularly in New Orleans, where the enslaved and free people of color made up a significant portion of the population, it was necessary, economically, to offer them some sort of inclusion. As is often the case in history, the need to increase profit by expanding the markets led to people of color being given a niche in which they could stretch their limbs. Many prominent businesses were owned and operated in New Orleans by free people of color, and even enslaved people were given the bare minimum of salary so that they could participate in the market. It will always be the case that before any moral argument takes hold against racism and slavery, the needs of the economy will force oppressors to treat the oppressed with a little bit of dignity. This was built upon by policy that sought to decrease the regularity of slave revolts and make the free people of color more invested in the system so that they would be more pliant. When naked force is unable to maintain the system, privileges are doled out. This was the way in small part for the French and in a larger part for the Spanish, for which they dealt with the issue of race in Louisiana. The Americans, particularly those of the southern planter class who were already preparing to gobble up the massive tracts of land that had just been added to their country's dominion, relied on overwhelming fear to keep their slaves obedient. In their minds, the most dangerous thing to the institution of slavery was hope. Hope of escape, or more accurately, hope of becoming free, was unacceptable. That meant that the existence of a substantial population of formerly enslaved people of color was an existential threat to American slavery. So the demographics of New Orleans were once again a problem to be solved by the new administration. But it also offered limitless opportunity to expand the slave system across the continent. Why didn't the Founding Fathers abolish slavery in the Constitution? To simplify it as much as possible, there were two reasons. One, the southern states would have never joined a union in which the bedrock of their social, economic, and political systems was outlawed. Two, the founders believed that it was unnecessary, as slavery was a dying institution that was being replaced, at least in the North, by industrial capitalism. They sought to quicken the pace at which it died off by creating laws that made it illegal to import slaves. First, in 1800, an act made it illegal to buy slaves from a foreign country. And then, in 1808, it banned all importation of new slaves. Even before these official federal acts, the states had ended the practice of slave importation. Of course, there would always be an underground market for slaves, but with the end of the legal market, the flow of new condemned souls to the New World turned into a trickle. With these two acts, the northern politicians believed that they had effectively answered the slave question without bloodshed. After all, how could the slave system expand if there wasn't a steady increase in the number of enslaved Africans being taken from their homes? Additionally, any slave that escaped now or died before having children meant a decrease in the overall enslaved labor population. What the northern politicians did not account for was the Louisiana Purchase. Suddenly, there were vast swaths of untapped land just begging to be cultivated into huge cash crop plantations, to be worked by black hands under the white whip. But how could the Southern slavocracy expand into such an empty space without the possibility of importing massive amounts of slaves? The Southern planters had already known that they were going to need to create a domestic slave trade, and to further degrade the humanity of the enslaved people by turning them essentially into breeding cattle. So the idea was already there, but the Louisiana Purchase created a demand that dwarfed anything that had come before. Furthermore, New Orleans was in prime position to become the beating heart of this unholy economy of human life. Lest we forget, New Orleans was the gateway to the Mississippi, the central artery of America, which was now controlled exclusively by the United States. They no longer had to worry about France or Spain blocking trade on this essential river. The flow of commerce and slavery up and down the continent had never been more fluid. It was up to William Claiborne to oversee the development of the territory of Orleans and navigate the plethora of conflicting interests that came with a place that housed so many different people. We can divide the many people that lived in New Orleans and its surrounding territory into two broad groups, the Louisianians and the newcomers. These two main groups can further be divided into secondary and tertiary groups. The Louisianians were those that had lived in the area for a substantial amount of time and had deeper roots than the newcomers. They consisted of white French Creoles, enslaved peoples, free people of color, a few remaining Spaniards. None of these people were overly enthusiastic about becoming a part of America, though the wealthy elite Creoles did recognize the economic opportunities now afforded to them. The newcomers were divided into Americans, Dominicans, and American slaves. The Dominicans were refugees of the Haitian Revolution. They came from a variety of different backgrounds, but on the whole, they fit into the existing New Orleans society easier than the Americans. The Americans were seekers of fortune. They came to New Orleans for economic reasons, and the elite Creoles eyed them with suspicion, mainly because they brought with them an insistence on using the English language. The slaves brought by the new American settlers were very different from the enslaved people in Louisiana. Some of them may have shared an ancestral homeland, but the Anglo-American slave system went to much greater lengths to destroy this identity than the Louisiana one. American slaves were forbidden to speak their own language, to practice their own religion, to dance and sing in their traditional way. While the act of enslavement itself dehumanizes a person, the Anglo-Americans went even further to strip their slaves of community, to lessen the chances of revolt by breaking the minds of the enslaved. Despite the overwhelming oppression the American slaves faced, they had established among themselves over the generations their own unique way of persevering under such adverse conditions. They brought this point of view with them when they moved to Louisiana, and mixing culture just like the mixing of paints. Adding one paint to another does not produce either in the previous pigments, but instead creates something new. Since New Orleans would be a hub of slave activity, the culture developed there among the enslaved peoples would be propagated out to the rest of the Deep South. By the year 1810, the population of the territory would be around 76,000, with about 17,000 living in New Orleans, making it the seventh largest city in the country and the third largest in the South. A huge portion of this population were enslaved peoples who would not be living there long term, but would instead be dispersed throughout the South. By this time, the city had spread outside the bounds of the French Quarter, and the newcomers had to find new places to build their homes. The different groups tended to settle together. For example, Dominicans settled in an area that we know as the Treme neighborhood, just beyond where the border of the French Quarter is. All of this is to say that the transitory period from colony to American territory was one of extreme growth and change. Such growth and change is bound to cause friction. As the 19th century began, there were two big factors driving the population boom in the territory of Orleans. One was the Louisiana Purchase, which opened the land to American settlers who migrated in the thousands. The second was the completion of the Haitian Revolution. When the Republic of Haiti was declared in 1804, it was a signal to the world that the door to Saint-Domingue's sugar had been slammed shut forever. Since the beginning of the revolution, the interruption of the plantation system in Haiti had left a gaping hole in the world sugar market. Yet there was still hope among the Spanish, British, and French that one of them might be able to retake the island and start the flow of sugar once again. That hope was finally extinguished when Dessalines declared the founding of the Haitian Republic in 1804 and expelled all colonial powers from the island. But there was still a demand for sugar, and the hole had to be filled somehow. This is where we see a boom in the sugar production of other islands in the Caribbean, especially in Spanish Cuba and British Jamaica. Even with these islands producing more sugar than they had ever before, there was still ravenous demand for the product. Any man seeking to make it big could see that sugar was the white gold on which he could build his fortune. However, there was a problem. Conventional thinking at the time was that sugarcane needed a year-round growing season. It took 15 months for sugarcane to fully grow, and then it had to be harvested and processed into granulated sugar and molasses, which took another few months. This was only possible in equatorial tropical climates, where it never got cold enough for the canes to die. The geographic limitation on the crop meant that even though the planters of Louisiana had wanted to get in on the sugar market, the climate of their region simply forbade it. For this reason, ever since New Orleans had been founded, the plantation system that grew out of it was relatively small, with operations of tobacco and indigo, cash crops of high value that yet paled in comparison to the profit yield of white gold. Coincidentally, at the end of the 18th century, just as it looked like the viability for slave labor was going to dry up due to the inefficiencies in cotton production, Eli Whitney received a patent for his cotton gin. Every American child is taught how the cotton gin made the plantation profits of the South explode and allowed the institution of slavery to gain a new lease on life. Likewise, 2 years after the cotton gin was invented, Louisiana planter and future first mayor of American New Orleans, Etienne de Boer, discovered a way to make granulated sugar out of the immature canes grown in Louisiana. Cotton in the Deep South and sugar in Louisiana, the need for a truly terrible number of slaves was suddenly born, just as the 19th century arrived. Between 1800 and 1810, the number of free people of color in Louisiana had grown to nearly 5,000. A majority of which were immigrants from Haiti. This made the white population nervous about the demographic shift of New Orleans and its surrounding territory, but not so much that it stopped them from importing over 20,000 new slaves to the city. Some of them would be sold to plantations in other southern states, but most either stayed in New Orleans or were sold to the rapidly expanding sugar plantations near the city, which were in constant need of new human capital due to the grueling conditions of sugar cultivation. See, the darkly ironic thing about the situation was that the slave owners feared above anything else a slave revolt like the one that had rocked Haiti for the last few decades, and since they believed that the revolt was caused by immutable violent characteristics carried within the genetics of the slaves in Haiti, they also believed that all they had to do to avoid such a revolt was to exclude the import of slaves from the island. They then went on to create the exact same horrific conditions on their sugar plantations that had been present on Saint-Domingue, which as we know was the real cause of the revolution. So it is of little surprise to the historical record that their worst fear came to pass on January 8, 1811. 2 days earlier, a plan for an uprising began spreading from plantation to plantation across the German coast, that area about 20 miles upriver of New Orleans that had been settled by Germans enticed over by John Law. It began at the Andre plantation, where a group of 15 enslaved people wounded the owner of the plantation and killed his son. They then made their way downriver, picking up slaves from plantations as they passed. Not all slaves joined them as they went, as many as 3/4 did not want to risk their lives in such an endeavor, but by the end of the first day, the group numbered between 200 and 500. They stopped for the night on the outskirts of Cannes-Brûlé, near where Louis Armstrong International Airport now stands. It is not really clear what the goals of the escapees were at this point. They were marching towards New Orleans well armed, but did they plan on attacking the city? Were they just trying to gather as many slaves from the plantations on the German coast before escaping to North or to Spanish Mexico? Or were their goals even loftier, hoping to incite a general slave revolt across the South to free all their brothers and sisters in chains? Whatever the plan was, they had already made the 1811 German Coast Uprising the largest slave revolt in U.S. history. Unfortunately, that was not enough. As the rebels rested for the night, white society was in a frenzied panic trying to respond to the situation. Colonel Andre, wounded owner of the Andre plantation, had made his way across the Mississippi to round up a militia to pursue the slaves. Likewise, in New Orleans, Governor Claiborne roused an army consisting of local militiamen, U.S. Army soldiers, and U.S. Navy sailors. On January 9th, both white armies set out to find the escaped slaves. Andre approached from upriver, Claiborne's men from the New Orleans. New Orleans was closer to Con Brûlé than Andre's men, and so they expected to come across the slaves first. But the slaves had departed from there in the early hours of January 9th. They had not continued their way downriver as they had the day before, but instead were making their way back upriver, unaware that they were heading right towards about 80 well-armed, terrified, and angry white men. By the morning of January 10th, the two groups were within sight of each other. The escapees tried to make their way to the dense forests and swamps of rural Louisiana to escape the militia, but about 45 of them were killed before they could make it to the safety of the tree line. Over the course of the next month, many of those who had escaped the massacre were captured and sent to trial in New Orleans. By February, nearly 100 escaped slaves were tried and executed. They were decapitated and their heads were displayed in the Place d'Armes, the place we now call Jackson Square. The brutal suppression of the German Coast Uprising sent a clear message to all slaves in Louisiana and throughout the American South. The new boss is in charge. Resistance will not be tolerated. But the legacy of the uprising would live on in the hearts of the enslaved peoples of America. Even though it is rarely mentioned in history books, by word of mouth and through legend, the brave souls that risked their lives to escape bondage that January would keep the hope of liberty alive for generations of African Americans. For the black population of New Orleans, the uprising was a bittersweet event. It showed that there was still the strength for resistance against white oppression, but it was not enough to overthrow the deeply entrenched systems of racism and slavery. For the white population, it was their worst nightmare come alive. For Governor Claiborne, it was just another headache in an endlessly vast sea of headaches. The French Creole had disliked being ruled over by Spanish administrators so much that they had incited an insurrection and gone into revolt. But at least those Spaniards had treated them with a slight amount of respect, and even went to the length of speaking as much French to the majority French-speaking population as they could. The Americans, on the other hand, did not speak a single word of French or Spanish, yet they insisted on treating the local population condescendingly, like children who needed their American fathers to come show them how proper society functioned. Their customs often clashed with the Creoles, especially at dances and fancy balls, where on at least one occasion the armed militia had to intervene to prevent a riot. In fact, nearly every week for the first few months of Claiborne's tenure, he had to contend with the Americans nearly coming to blows with the French and Spanish. It got so bad that he even wrote a letter to the Secretary of State, James Madison, to complain about how much of a pain in his ass these balls were becoming. But the governor couldn't just outlaw the balls. That would surely bring violence, as the Creoles prized nothing as much as they did their parties. Claiborne not only had to contend with a restive domestic population in New Orleans, there was also the issue of immigration. New Orleans was a growing city, and most of that growth came from new immigrants. The Dominican refugees fit in well enough with the Creoles, but they were supplemented by a large number of white American Southerners. These two groups got off on the wrong foot immediately, as Claiborne's administration feared that Dominicans would bring the Haitian Revolution with them if they brought their slaves, so they were forced to sell them in Cuba or Jamaica before entering New Orleans. On the flip side, the Americans were allowed to bring any slave they wished, and since slavery was the marker of wealth at that time, the Americans seemed to usurp the Dominicans, who had been the highest class group in their old homes. Along with their slaves, the Americans brought different ideas when it came to racial mixing. In Saint-Domingue, Cuba, and in New Orleans during the Spanish period, the mixing of black and white people was much more common than in southern U.S. The free people of color of New Orleans made up an important class in the city. Over the generations, they had managed to accrue enough wealth to own a modest portion of real estate in the French Quarter. Interestingly enough, this wealth was predominantly concentrated among the free women of color, who likely owned twice as much property as the free men of color. With wealth came enough status to allow them to participate in societal events. There were several dance halls that held special nights in which people of color and whites could all dance together. Of course, the number of affluent free people of color was greatly eclipsed by the number of poor people of color who had to eke out a living, and slaves who could make no living at all. This was all foreign to the Americans, who were used to seeing all black people in servile positions, whether they were slaves or free. In order to rectify this contradiction in their minds, the 1804 legislature of the Territory of New Orleans repealed many of the rights of enslaved people, the most important of which was the right to a contract, which when completed meant the slave was now free. In the coming years, the Legislative Council would also crack down on rights for free people of color, including banning any non-white person from Haiti from entering New Orleans and decreeing that official documents had to designate whether a person was of color. They managed to retain their property and some sense of their place in society because Claiborne and his administration could not just overturn the decades of tradition that had built up in New Orleans without risking a Creole revolution. Language and racial dynamics were not the only differences between the Creoles and the Americans. They also differed in those practices that were of utmost importance in those days, that is, religion. The French Creole and the few Spaniards left in New Orleans were overwhelmingly Catholic, while the Americans were almost exclusively Protestant. This was mirrored within the black community, with a twist. The Afro-Louisianians, who had been living there for generations, practiced their own unique blend of Catholicism and several traditional African religions. Voodoo was not as strong of a religious sect in Louisiana as it was in Haiti. The new enslaved people brought by the Americans were mostly Protestants, but they were barred from worshiping in the Protestant churches that the white people had built in New Orleans. It's hard to imagine that New Orleans had existed for nearly 100 years at this point and had never had a Protestant church yet. But the first one wasn't built until 1805. While clashes between the religions were rarer and less violent than those between supporters of different dancing styles, the addition of Protestantism to New Orleans would add its fair share to Claiborne's collection of headaches. As the years went on, though, the animosity between the Creoles and Americans gradually lessened, helped along by the fact that Claiborne took a page out of the early Spanish governor's book and married a local French Creole woman to ingratiate himself with high society. This coming together of the territorial government and the elite Creoles was not a one-way street of loyalty. As the locals became more pliant to the new regime, Claiborne found himself sympathizing more and more with their interests. To illustrate this, I want to discuss how the government's attitude shifted in terms of treatment of Caribbean refugees. When New Orleans had barred its gates to Dominican refugees if they brought their slaves, this caused them to seek other ports in which to settle. Some went north to the coastal cities of the United States, some went to British Jamaica, a large chunk of them headed for the eastern portion of Cuba. After all, the French Empire and Spain were allies, and so any French-speaking refugees were welcome to settle in Spanish colonies. By 1806, nearly 30,000 Dominican refugees, representing whites, free people of color, and slaves, had settled on the eastern half of the island of Cuba. Things went well for them for a few years. It really seemed like they had found a second home, one that was very similar to the one that they had left back in Saint-Domingue. Then, in 1808, the Spanish king Carlos IV abdicated the throne. Emperor Napoleon of France took this opportunity to swipe the crown from Carlos's head and place it on his brother, Joseph Bonaparte's head. This kicked off a guerrilla civil war in Spain, with the French, allied to now King José Bonaparte, versus the Spanish military juntas and their allies, the British. This civil war spread to Spain's colonies, many of which took the opportunity to move towards independence. But in Cuba, it led to the call to expel all French-speaking peoples from the island if they did not renounce France. In 1809, those Dominican refugees that refused to swear an oath of loyalty to Spain packed up their belongings once more and left to find another home. They looked once more towards New Orleans. Surprisingly, this time the city was much more sympathetic to their plight. They even allowed them to bring their slaves with them. Though they were forced to keep their slaves on the ships until Congress could decide whether they really wanted to let them into the country. After a month-long debate, the enslaved people were finally allowed to set foot in New Orleans. It took less than a year for Cuba to empty its refuse onto New Orleans. In the end, around 9,000 former San Domingans made their way to the city with nearly a one-third split between whites, free people of color, and slaves. The gender split was about 55% female to 45% male, not counting children. This figure is more surprising when you realize that white men outnumbered white women, but among free people of color, women greatly outnumbered men. Additionally, there were about as many enslaved women as there were white men, and there were actually more free women of color than there were white men. To put in perspective how much of an influence these Dominican refugees had on New Orleans, remember that the total population of the city a year after they arrived was 17,000. That meant that the 9,000 Dominicans that had arrived made up an overall majority of the city. Now, not all the Dominicans stayed in New Orleans. Specifically, the free men of color found themselves unwelcome and so moved on. But we can assume that those that remained made up at least a significant plurality within the city, if not an outright majority. Well, not exactly within the city. As I briefly mentioned before, the explosion of the population of New Orleans during the first decade of the 1800s meant that people had to find accommodation outside the French Quarter. This was the time of the establishment of the neighborhoods of Marigny and Treme. Despite living outside the French Quarter, the Dominicans had strong, friendly connections to the Creole population. The same cannot be said of the relationship between the Anglo-Americans and the Dominicans. Even though Claiborne and his government had been cordial to the refugees, even petitioning Congress to allow them to keep their slaves, the local American elites were loath to allow such an influx of French-speaking competitors. What really rubbed the Americans the wrong way about the Dominicans is that they were powerful and they were proudly, fiercely un-American. While the Louisiana Creoles and remaining Spaniards might have been reluctant to assimilate with their new countrymen, they did not have the excised control over the government and economy that they had held at the beginning of the Spanish period. Sure, the wealthy Creole elite still had to be placated sometimes, but they were no longer an indomitable force to be reckoned with. That was not such the case with the Dominicans. They were by far the largest group in the city, and the white Dominicans in particular were wealthy and well-educated. They filled important roles in New Orleans society, especially in the legal practice, and used this along with their numbers to leverage the city and the territory to follow their preferred politics. And beyond politics, there would be a visible cultural drift towards Dominican culture, which was predominantly French Creole with a dash of Spanish Cuba. Culture and politics, the Dominicans held sway over these spheres and prevented the swift assimilation of New Orleans into the American system, ensuring that the city would stand out among its contemporaries, especially for the 2 generations or so that they were at the apex of their power in the city. And even now, it is easy to see that New Orleans is very different from other American cities. While white Dominicans were a large group, their influence over the rest of the city relied mostly on their economic power. They were, however, outnumbered within the city by one group who may not have been as homogeneous culturally and politically as the white Dominicans, but their numbers alone dwarfed every other group. In 1810, of the 17,000 people in New Orleans, maybe a little over half were Dominican, but 63% of the total population were people of color. This was the most striking difference between New Orleans and the rest of the country. Even in the South, where a third of the population was black, they were spread between isolated plantations, and none of the urban centers had anywhere close to the proportion of people of color there were in New Orleans. They may have lacked the economic and political power of the whites, but it is impossible for any population of that size to not have a significant impact on the character of a city. The mingling of the races in New Orleans meant that along with Spanish tangos and French quadrilles, there were tinges of African dance and music. The food of the city, including its signature dish of gumbo, was heavily influenced, if not outright invented, by people of color. The music, the art, the theater, everything that made New Orleans, relied on the tastes and traditions of the majority black population. But like I said, this group was not as homogeneous as the whites were. Among the militias that put down the German Slave Coast Uprising were free men of color, hoping to prove their loyalty to white society with an offering of blood. As we see throughout history, class interests can often trump racial interests to split oppressed groups apart and pit them against each other. And here we saw relatively well-off free people of color side with both poor and rich whites to put down a black revolution. This is not to knock any specific group or to suggest that each of us would do anything different if put in their situation. It is impossible to know what you might do if you were subject to the same conditions. However, I thought it was important to take notice that even while black people made up a majority of New Orleans, they did not operate as a single unit. To summarize, the American territorial period from 1804 to 1812, we can say that it was an era of spectacular growth. In 1810, the population of Louisiana was 76,000, more than double what it had been in 1785. The territory was massive, and this population was not spread equally within it. Most people lived around the Mississippi Delta, with the largest concentration being in New Orleans, of course. Over the next decade, the growth would continue, with the population doubling again by 1820. With growth came extreme demographic shifts and a great diversifying of the population. There were Scots, Irish, Dominicans, Americans. They were black, white, free, enslaved, Protestant and Catholic, rich and poor. Throughout all this change, there was a core cultural bedrock of French Creole that remained steadfast even as more people came and built on top of it. The future was bright for New Orleans and the territory of Orleans, but it would not go into it as a mere lowly territory. On April 30th, 1812, the United States Congress accepted the petition of the people of the territory of Orleans, and Louisiana was admitted into the Union as the 18th state. The naming of Louisiana was a little awkward, as at that time the territory of Louisiana still existed, but this was quickly rectified as it was renamed to the Missouri Territory. The transfer of political power was seamless, as Claiborne was elected the first governor of the new state, in large part due to the Dominican vote that he had secured by allowing the refugees to settle in New Orleans. The first president of the Louisiana Senate was Julien Poydras, the businessman and poet, now politician. The first elected mayor of New Orleans was Nicolas Girod, who may be known better as one of the main backers of a harebrained plan to jailbreak Napoleon Bonaparte from his exile in St. Helena and bring him back to New Orleans to live in the Napoleon House, which Girod owned and furnished. Unfortunately, Napoleon died before he could ever set foot in New Orleans. 6 weeks after Louisiana officially became a state, the United States of America declared war on Great Britain. The War of 1812, as it is known, was the first time since the War of Independence that America officially went to war with a European power. It was caused by a myriad of factors, including restrictions on trade between France and America imposed by Britain, the impressment into service of U.S. sailors and vessels by the British, conflicts on the western frontier between American settlers and British allied Native American groups, and a general desire within America to establish themselves as the undisputed masters of the North American continent. All of these factors were important to people in New Orleans. The French Creoles obviously held a centuries-old hatred of the British, and many of them were Bonapartists, who supported the French Empire in their war against Great Britain. The American businessmen were extremely chauvinistic, and saw the westward expansion of the United States as something that was both economically advantageous and divinely ordained. Above all, New Orleans was a city whose lifeblood was trade. It produced no valuable resources, but thrived off of bringing European luxury goods into America and shipping tobacco, sugar, and cotton to Europe. Any interruption of the flow of goods between New Orleans and Europe was deeply insulting and threatening to the people who made a living there. So next time, we will dive into the story of the War of 1812, and to add a little more excitement, we will also do an overview of the criminal element within the city that was growing along with everything else. The tradition of crime, piracy, and black market trading around New Orleans runs very deep. After all, if you recall, its first batch of settlers were the dregs of France's prison. I hope you will join me next time for the history of New Orleans.